ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد, continuing our discussion regarding the miracles of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those miracles of his which were recorded by his companions, which were passed down to us generation after generation. Obviously, these miracles are far too numerous to be able to be listed in their entirety. However, we have a large chapter here, a sizable chapter, in Tahdhib al-Asma wal-Lughat, which list these miracles. If a person wishes to really read a book which mentions and lists all of these miracles in chapters, in sections, with the original text, with the original narrations, a very sizable part of Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya for Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah. He has a huge section because his book, Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, and I mention this because the book has been translated. I believe the entire book has been translated. It was summarized and then translated by Dar es-Salam in Riyadh. This was many years ago. I'm sure others have translated as well. And so this book, authored by Ibn Kathir, the Mufassir, Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah, he has 2 volumes of his book on history, Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, dedicated to the life and times of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his biography, very detailed. And then after that, at the end of that, he has a very sizable section which lists in order and in chapters and explained very well, very thoroughly, many of the miracles of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hundreds. So that would be a good reference for somebody who wishes to continue this topic on their own. We reached last week to the prophecy which tells us that Al-Hasan radiyallahu anhu, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his grandson Al-Hasan, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, the elder son, that he would be instrumental in bringing peace between 2 large factions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's nation after him. And this occurred in the time of Al-Hasan radiyallahu anhu, when he was the Khalifa for a very short time, roughly 6 months. And he then succeeded to Muawiyah radiyallahu anhu, and the entire ummah was united under the leadership and the kingship of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, bringing peace and harmony between the Muslims of Al-Iraq, of the East, and the Muslims of the West, the Muslims of Al-Sham. يقول النووي رحمه الله تعالى وبأن يعني وبإخباره صلى الله عليه وسلم أن سعد بن أبي وقاص يعيش حتى ينتفع به أقوام ويضر به آخرون. وهذه رواية موجودة في البخاري ومسلم. Another prophecy of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was his prophecy regarding the life of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. This is referring to a narration recorded by Bukhari and Muslim, collected by both Bukhari and Muslim, in which Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was in Mecca with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He fell very ill, and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is one of the first Muslims. Matter of fact, there was a time when he was a fourth of the entire, or a fifth or a fourth of the entire Muslim population at the time. It was him and a few others with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca, and he was the first to shoot an arrow in battle for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's one of the 10 companions given glad tidings of paradise. We have 10 companions that were mentioned together in a narration. These 10, they are referred to as the 10 companions giving glad tidings of paradise. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is one of them. Sa'd ibn Malik radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He fell very ill in Mecca. And when he did, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to visit him. And Sa'd at the time had only one daughter. He was a very rich man. And he was very distraught. He was very distraught that he would pass away in Mecca. And the reason for that is that Sa'd radiyallahu anhu made hijrah. He migrated with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from Mecca to Medina. And so to go back to Mecca afterwards and to die in Mecca after having left it off for the sake of Allah in hijrah, this was a very distressing notion to him. But when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to visit him in his illness, he asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam rhetorically, "Shall I pass away in Mecca while the others are able to keep the reward of their migration?" And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, "Perhaps you are going to remain. Perhaps you're not going to die." And Sa'd was almost positive he was dying, and he was discussing his inheritance with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was very, very sick, and he had considered himself as good as dead. He was discussing inheritance and who he's going to leave his money behind to, who he's going to leave his wealth behind to. He only had one daughter. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam indicated to him that there is another possibility. Maybe you won't die. Maybe you will continue to live a long, thriving life in the way of Allah, to the extent that many of the Muslims will be benefited by your presence, and many of the enemies of Islam will be harmed by it as well. So after this interaction, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas regained his health. He didn't die, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam indicated that he might live. He did live, and he lived a very long life after that. He had many more children after that, more than 10 children after that incident. And he became the governor of Al-Kufa. Actually, Al-Kufa was established by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. He's the reason for Al-Kufa. Al-Kufa is a major city in Iraq, and it's named Al-Kufa min al-Kafaf, because so many people mustered together around Sa'd radiyallahu anhu to come and live in his presence and be around him, and it became a very large, thriving city. He was one of the generals in battle on many occasions, and he was the governor of Al-Kufa in Iraq, and he lived a very long life after that. Many things occurred But most notably, many Muslims were benefited by his presence, and many of their enemies were harmed by his presence as well. This narration has been collected by both Bukhari and Muslim. يقول وبأن النجاشي مات يومكم هذا وهو بالحبشة. This narration is also in Bukhari and Muslim. Another one of his miracles, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is that An-Najashi. An-Najashi is an Arabic term, and it's a title that is given to the king of Ethiopia and its area. This is called An-Najashi. Just like we have, for instance, the pharaohs, Fir'aun. That's not his name. It's mentioned in the Quran, Fir'aun. That's not his name. His name is Ramses. However, his title is Pharaoh. So the Arabs, they refer to the emperor, the one on the throne of the Persians, as Kisra. That's his title. And the emperor of the Romans as Qaisar. And they refer to the king of Ethiopia and these regions as An-Najashi. In the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the companions were allowed to migrate to Ethiopia. Why Ethiopia? There's just the water between it and the Arab Peninsula. They would go across the water there and be living there in what is modern day Ethiopia. And they made hijrah to there. And the most notable person to have made hijrah is Salama with her husband, Abu Salama, at the time. He later passed away there, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam married her. She became one of our mothers, one of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also, Ja'far radiyallahu anhu, as well made hijrah to Al-Habasha. Was also referred to as Abyssinia at the time, modern day Ethiopia. As well, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud made hijrah there, and many others of the companions. But when they arrived there in Abyssinia, they were taken in by An-Najashi, the king of Abyssinia at the time. An-Najashi and his kingdom were Christians. And he heard of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he heard of the companions who were seeking refuge in his dominion. Now, when they arrived, they began to live normally and interact and try to start their own transactions and business in order to try to survive and put some roots down. Well, the people of Quraysh, the disbelievers of Quraysh at the time, they did not like this at all. And so they sent a couple of their best speakers and their most persuasive negotiators to Abyssinia. They sent them to speak to An-Najashi, bearing many gifts, to convince him to take these companions into custody and to hand them over to them. They said, you have these people living amongst you. They came from where we're from. These people These people they're essentially criminals that are trying to evade our justice. This is the smear campaign they were going on. And we would like for you to hand them over. Kick them out of your domain, send them back across the water with us. And so An-Najashi summoned them, and he summoned these two men from Quraysh. They brought many, many gifts, and they tried to persuade him to hand them over. Najashi refused to hand them over because they refused to hand them over. And the reason for this, he refused to hand them over. And the reason for this is that when he summoned them to his court and each gave his argument, they tried to claim that these people had done this and had done that. So you need to hand them over, and these people are basically people who have come from they're basically people that have committed great crimes. You need to hand them over and they kind of came as if they were trying to deliberate between our people and your people kind of thing. And Najashi wasn't having it. He didn't accept this argument because when he asked them what were their crimes, what's the issue, why do you want me to do this? And then Najashi at the time was known for his justice. He was known for his fairness. He was a fair man. He was a Christian at the time. So when they tried to articulate that they had changed their religion and they had spread this foul religion amongst us and caused us to be at odds with one another, and some have become Muslim and some have remained upon our religion and our native religion, and this has caused much strife. He did not accept this argument and refused to oblige them. Well, the person who was one of those speakers was Amr ibn al-As, radiyallahu anhu. This was before he became Muslim. He was known for having a very honey-dipped tongue. He was very good at speaking, very persuasive. And so he decided to crank it up a little bit, and he decided to make An-Najashi personally angry with them, with these companions. So he said to them, you don't hand these folks over to us. There was about 80 of the companions collectively that had made this hijrah. You're refusing to hand them over, but what you don't know is that these companions, these individuals, they have made up this religion, and part of their belief and part of their religion is insulting Isa ibn Maryam, insulting Jesus. So we said An-Najashi was Christian. And so he embellished the truth much, and he kind of made it a personal issue, almost a personal attack against the Najashi and his religion. So Najashi called for them again, a second time, and when Ja'far radiyallahu anhu appeared in his court, he recited to him much of Surah Maryam. Surah Maryam discusses the immaculate and miraculous nature of the birth of Isa alayhi salatu wassalam and what had happened and transpired between Maryam and her people and the birth of Isa and so on and so forth. So An-Najashi listened very attentively to this recitation, listened very closely to these verses of the Quran, and at that moment he returned all of the gifts that the people of Quraysh had sent for him. He said, I don't want these gifts. and no one will harm these people. These people and I share the same beliefs regarding Isa ibn Maryam, alayhi salatu wassalam. And he said, whoever interferes with these people, they will have a great rebuke from me and my government. And so they remained under the protection of An-Najashi. Now this was a few years before the Prophet ﷺ migrated from Mecca to Medina. Ja'far radiallahu anhu and the companions there with him remained there for many years, and they returned about 5 or 6 years after Hijrah. So they stayed there for a long time under the protection of An-Najashi, and the Najashi himself became Muslim. The problem, though, was that it was not appropriate, it was not possible for him to publicly accept and embrace Islam. This would have caused too much conflict in his government. It would have caused too much conflict amongst his people. Islam was still very new, but he had accepted Islam. And An-Najashi is not considered a companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's considered to be a mukhadram. There's a group of people that are mentioned by the historians and the scholars of hadith that are referred to as al-mukhadramin. Al-mukhadramun, they are a group of people who were contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but never met him as Muslims, because the condition of being considered a companion is that a person has to have physically met the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a believer, believing in him, and then dying upon that belief. If a person believes in him and lives in the same time but never met him as a Muslim, this person is not considered technically to be a companion, but they're considered to be mukhadram. Mukhadram is someone who is a contemporary of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam but didn't meet him as a Muslim. And Najashi is considered to be a mukhadram, rahimahullah ta'ala, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. When he passed away, he was not publicly a Muslim, so he didn't really have anybody to make salat al-janazah over him. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was informed by Allah of the death of An-Najashi. This is one of his prophecies. The day that he died, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was informed by Jibreel that An-Najashi has passed away. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam personally praised An-Najashi by telling his companions, your brother in Abyssinia has passed away, and he made Salat al-Ghaib. Salat al-Ghaib is making Salat al-Janazah, the funeral prayer, over someone who has passed away, but the body is not present, it's not accessible. And this only happened one time in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's lifetime. Salat al-Ghaib, he only made it one time, and that was for An-Najashi. It is incorrect we have in our modern time that a lot of times if we hear of someone who has passed away, we make Salat al-Ghaib for them. Salat al-Ghaib, really, the funeral prayer which is performed when the people praying are in one place and the body is in another. This is performed really according to the Sunnah only when the person doesn't have anyone to make salat al-janazah over them. Otherwise, many companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away in lands away from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, passed away in far off lands, in other regions, in other areas. We don't have any time where he performed Salat al-Ghaib. This was only for Najashi. This is a great honor for a Najashi, and this is considered to be one of the prophecies of our Prophet and Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. يقول وبأن الأسود العنسي قتل ليلتكم هذه وهو باليمن. Another prophecy, and this was mentioned by Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala in Al-Fatih. This story was also mentioned by Ibn Hajar in his book Al-Isaba fi Tamyiz al-Sahaba. And that is that Al-Aswad al-Ansi, this was a man who was in Yemen. He was a contemporary of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was claiming to be a prophet. He was claiming to be a prophet and claiming to receive revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Aswad al-Ansi was a very, very scary man. He was very powerful himself physically, and he was a sorcerer, a magician. He had a lot of dealings with a particular jinn that was said to have inhabited his body and helped him in certain things. And he was later killed by the Muslims, by the companions, radiallahu anhum, when he was beginning to start to ramp up an army and a military to try to invade Medina and try to go up against the companions radiallahu anhum. And subsequently, he was killed by his own people. But the night that he was killed in Yemen, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in Medina, and he was informed his companions immediately that Al-Aswad al-Ansi has been killed. And this is, again, one of his prophecies. This is Al-Ghayb al-Nisbi, يعني بالنسبة له آنذاك. يقول وبأن المسلمين يقاتلون الترك صغار الأعين إعراض الوجوه ظلف الأنوف. He says, he says, rahimahullah, An-Nawawi tells us another prophecy of his, prophecies meaning that something that happened in the past that could not have possibly been known by anyone except by being informed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Prophecies of something that had happened at the same time, but he could not have known that without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informing him. Prophecies of future things, something that happened in the future or will happen. We have, many, dozens, if not hundreds of narrations discussing this. One of those prophecies is that the Muslims will come to fight against the Turk. The Turk it is not modern day Turkey, because we refer to modern day Turkey as Turkiya, but this really is not what's intended in the Sunnah. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says at-Turk, the Turkish people, he's not speaking about the Turkish people that come to mind for us. The Turkish in the Sunnah is referring to the Mongols and that area, that region of Asia. This is referred to as a Turk, right? Turkey, modern day Turkey, at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a part of it was considered to be part of Asham, small part of it, and the rest was considered to be part of Persia, min al-Furs, min Faris. However, Al-Atrak or At-Turk in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is speaking about the Mongols, and this, of course, was a huge era in the history of the Muslim empire when the Muslim armies began to clash with these Turk, with these Mongols. A lot of blood was spilled. They invaded, especially in the initial early days of fighting against the Mongols with Genghis Khan, and this continued on. Later, they became Muslim, but in the early times when they first began their campaign against the Muslims and invaded Iraq, where the center, the Muslim Khilafah was centralized there in Iraq at the time, in Baghdad. And basically, if you look into history and you see why the Mongols started their war with the Muslims, it was just a very unfortunate exchange that happened between the Khalifa at the time and his advisors and Genghis Khan. It was an issue of offense. Genghis Khan was offended by the Muslim Khalifa at the time. Genghis Khan wasn't necessarily fighting against the Muslims and really the world. He wasn't fighting to try to necessarily conquer everything. That later became an issue, and Genghis Khan later became convinced that he was divinely inspired and divinely guided. But this isn't why he started his campaign, and especially against the Muslims. He wanted to reestablish the Silk Road, which is a kind of a connection between Persia, Asia, and the Arab world on into Europe, where goods and it's referred to as the Silk Road because the best silk came from Persia at the time. He wanted to unite all of the regions where that pathway is, that we all collaborate in protecting it and making it safe and opening it and giving those merchants safe harbor and safe travel in order to strengthen the relationship between these different regions and strengthen importation and exportation. He wanted to sell, he wanted to be a merchant with his people. And unfortunately, he had a very, very terrible advisor, and he advised him, the Khalifa of the Muslims at the time in Baghdad, when Genghis Khan sent messengers to bring gifts to the Khalifa and so forth to try to establish this relationship. The Khalifa had his messengers shaved. He had their heads shaved, which was an insult to Genghis Khan. He did this to belittle him. Little did he know that the Mongols at the time were very fierce warriors. They were a culture of war. They were forged in war, very terrible on the battlefield, and very numerous. The Prophet ﷺ prophesied, as is in Bukhari and Muslim, that the Muslims will come to fight against the Turk, the Mongols. He described them as having very beady eyes, small eyes, having very wide faces, and having flat and wide noses. This is exactly the description of the Mongol race at the time, and obviously this came to pass. a few hundred years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's passing. We will continue this topic next week, inshallah ta'ala. نكتفي بهذا القدر والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا.